I'm assuming that most of you are curious about what a Birmingham geographer has got up to in the 57 years since graduating in July 1965. The quick story is that I added an MSc in ecology and trained in advertising practice, specializing in copy editing. I then joined the civil service, first time around, working in London for starters. First off Fleet Street for Lintas, then by the Regent's Park. The Avengers and later Paddington Bear are other stories. And thirdly, in Lower Whitehall, and did a day release course in town and country planning at what became Westminster University. RTPI membership required an element of development management experience, so two of us did a one-year staff exchange with Hampshire County Council colleagues. I then left the civil service to work for the first of two county councils, Norfolk, which was an excellent working environment. I worked on the county development plan and co-managed the first Heritage Coast Management Plan for North Norfolk, among other things. Fate then stepped in the form of the 1974 local government reorganisation. I accepted a swift promotion to manage the countryside service for North West Wales, the original Gwynedd County, which included my home island of Anglesey, where I had attended school in the port town of Holyhead, from which another Birmingham geographer graduated in 1963. I stayed with Gwynedd for 8 years, best part of a decade, till I was almost 39. Norfolk tried to attract me back, and I turned down 2 Deputy National Park Officer interviews, wrongly so in the case of one of them, when I mistakenly put what I believed to be my personal interest first. My personal interest was centred on a marriage, I should explain. A move was now required, and it was to respond to more civil service countryside job adverts. I rejoined the Countryside Commission that had begun in 1968, when it had metamorphosed out of a 1949 Act National Parks Commission. They wanted me to work in the Midlands region, which I did for 5 years, followed by a year in the Commission's headquarters Policy Directorate. Like my Norfolk time, they were good years. I got to work across 5 counties and started the work of producing a national countryside design guide. Work that saw fruition in the 1999 publication, Wales Making Places. That, though, was almost incidental to the mainstream of my countryside planning career, which was centred on the conservation of natural beauty and the development of better public access opportunities into the countryside. Countryside is a descriptive and a geographical term. That said, the countryside is mostly privately owned, some by descendants of the Normans, other by Anglo-Saxons, some by the Celts, and some by British investment institutions, more recent incomers, and foreign investors. The Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000 allowed for public access areas to be identified and shown on Ordnance Survey maps. Talking of Ordnance Survey maps, a few of you may be familiar with the geography of the Isle of Anglesey. Holy Island Anglesey, some 39 square kilometres in extent, has a strait between it and the main island of Anglesey. Until about 5 years ago, it was unnamed on maps. That was remarkable, but may have also gone unnoticed. To name a street may be a life objective for some, but to name a strait, the work of a Magellan or a Cook? Consulting a local and truly Welsh friend, we persuaded the Ordnance Survey to name this sea water, and in 2 languages. Neither the map nor the map titles are for reproduction, I should just point out. The final 21 years of my career in countryside planning were back with central government. It suited me, my temperament, and my father would have been pleased, and I think proud. Pride, though, is a mixed quality, I do know. I was able, by a mix of chance and determination, to top out my career developing a national landscape information system. If that sounds grand, well, it was. But it did not happen overnight. It took years, and not just in the final employment. It began at least 2 jobs before, when working for Gwynedd County Council. There, the first National Park Plan for Snowdonia required a hefty section on the park's landscape. I was asked to lead on that, a big task. I persuaded the voluntary National Park Society to undertake a park-wide survey, subdividing as they thought fit. Another survey of half of Anglesey followed, this time by graduates on an employment scheme. Politically, this was the mid-1970s. As a public countryside service, we ran a tree planting scheme and several other big projects. There followed a national movement generated by landowners to provide and support a voluntary scheme of conservation guidance, half paid for by the government. Called FWAG, it ran for years, though never had sufficient advisory capacity and was, if anything, a distraction from the scale of advice required. That said, there was much land manager and conservation interest in it, as awareness was rising. Not, though, it has turned out, rising sufficiently. The countryside landowning and land management community may have worked, one might say, assiduously or by default, to minimize the effectiveness of public sector advice, whilst taking advantage of payment schemes, some of them aimed at supporting conservation. I suspect this is a blend of property conservatism and financial opportunity. Nature and landscape overall have scarcely benefited. An additional fact is that most politicians are not tuned into these matters and so do not properly understand the issues, the losses, the opportunities, nor the significance for their constituents. Unsurprisingly, they do not provide enough funding. Yet the countryside can be a social service and can provide education. Something significant happened around 1988. A statutory public inquiry was held into the proposed North Pennines area of outstanding natural beauty. Its inspector summoned the chief officer of the proposing national agency, the Countryside Commission, for whom I was working, though I was not involved with the inquiry. The Commission's head had to admit to the inspector that there was not a standard method by which AONB areas were identified. Rather, it was cumulative practice handled between a small number of the agency's staff. The original field officer had retired. Devising a national methodology for identifying landscapes became a high priority. A consultant, Caris Swanwick of Land Use Consultants, was on hand to do this. She had a methodology called character areas available for testing. While this was going on, Warwickshire County Planning Department had agreed to a 3-year project jointly with the Midlands regional arm of the Countryside Commission, for whom I was working. The result was 2 publications. In February 1991. One was by Warwickshire County Council, a series of maps, strategies and land management guidance for the selected pilot area of the Arden. The other was the methodology written by the Countryside Commission. It will not surprise you that the character areas methodology was chosen as the core method of the Warwickshire trial method. It may also not surprise you that I, with scientific research training, had questions about the overly vague character areas methodology. That it was adopted for a national map of England and then pushed out to the counties and boroughs to detail up, and then promoted in colonial style into the Council of Europe's putative European Landscape Convention, may also not surprise you. Those of you with deep English veins may even feel a warm welling of pride at yet another national achievement. And so, life goes on. England, through natural England, and the umbilical Whitehall DEFRA, has persisted with what I call the vague character areas methodology. Scotland and Ireland, both north and south, have struggled to knit it together. Ireland got in a real mess with it in the early 2000s, ignoring my and others' warnings. Meanwhile, we in Wales refused to adopt character areas as the main approach, as some of us had learnt from experience, a quality, I suggest, that was surprisingly lacking in the English approach that was steeped in thoughts about AONB's natural beauty and amenity. Yet England had its reasons, no doubt. That said, there have been colleagues working in Wales who are of the character areas school of thought. What 2 Wales colleagues of mine and I, in 1995 to 1997, brought to bear on the devising of a national methodology for distinguishing between landscapes was this. A, to ask what was the purpose of a landscape assessment. B, to do fundamental thinking about the component nature of a landscape. C, having realized that what was required of a landscape assessment was information that could inform decision-making, whether for development planning or land management. The methodology then took shape. Its timing in 1996 was crucial as GIS was taking over from paper map recording. 4 trial areas were tested for the Wales method, which we called land map. One word. The name was derived from a working phrase during these 1997 area pilots. The phrase was landscape assessment and decision-making process. And out of that comes land map. There was a deliberately ambitious intention here. Since 2008, land map has been acknowledged as the landscape baseline information for all Wales. It has over 10,000 individual landscape areas across 5 different aspect maps in the GIS system. 4 of the 5 aspect maps differentiate the areas into 4 grades of importance. The qualities for the qualities that led to the identification of each area. That qualitative labeling is invaluable when weighing decisions about land management and development. Successive editions of the Welsh Government's Planning Policy Wales have recommended LandMap. Why did LandMap succeed? I suggest it was because we took the trouble and time to consult widely and in depth about both what was required and what we were proposing as a method of meeting these requirements. A National Landscape Partnership Group, as well as public focus groups and other consultative meetings, all ensured the necessary cohesion to carry the method forward. There are lessons here, some of which may be obvious. Your careers may or not allow for opportunities such as the one I have just described. You may find yourselves involved, usually with a quick turnover of tasks. Sometimes, though, the challenge and opportunity may present itself to do a deep thinking piece. It may include bringing diverse colleagues along with you. The parameters with which you are working may not be entirely clear, and the product and the outcome less so. Worry not. Press on best you can and make at least mental notes for possible future use. Not everything that is necessary for a well-planned environment will be apparent. A situation as found may or not offer clues to next steps, to the optimum changes required. A mix of lateral and logical thinking will be needed. What did I learn on entering the planning profession? And what did geography give me all those years ago? Many of those experiences from the 1960s and 70s feel like only yesterday. One was young, as you are now. The cartography we learned here at Birmingham found expression in a mapping project on transit caravan and camping sites for England and Wales under a clause of the 1968 Countryside Act. Birmingham cartography also scored in my work in the 1970 Whitehall Maps Office on an environmental atlas and on a map exercise for number 10 for visitors to find Chequers, the Prime Minister's residence in the Chilterns. Some planning advice involves economics and statistics. That Birmingham experience, supplemented by the Ecology MSc, was relevant both to the Environment Atlas and the Norfolk Tourism Research to inform the County Development Plan. There, in Norfolk, we contracted economists using central government funds. Apart from time spent poring over maps and other documents, planning involves visualizing places. More than visualizing, experiencing them in one's imagination in 3 dimensions and more. The sound environment, the possible weather at different seasons, times of day. As a planner, one must try to experience places when not present. Geography's practice of fieldwork is vitally important in this, I suggest. It is helpful to build a store of place memories. Each of us do this individually, lacing visual memories with associations. I'm sure you follow my drift. Geographical scale is also a factor, from small areas and places through to enormous tracts of land, prairies, steppes, mountain ranges, the Mediterranean region. International comparisons may be relevant and helpful. The Royal Town Planning Institute, for example, has around 25,000 members worldwide. Though based in London, many of its members work exclusively on other continents. My work experience was confined to England and Wales, so I will not expand on foreign practice of geography or planning, except to say that my natural geographer daughter, who astonished us with her 100% in GCSE Geography in 2005, has lived near the Zambezi River most of the time since then. Living social and regional geography alongside her carpenter ranger husband. These days, she is a software developer for a British wind energy company, which, as an environmentalist since my student days here in B15, is pleasing. Planning is mainly for people, for humans, by humans, for humans. Some, though, is for nature, for other species and their habitats, their respective ecos, their homes. Some planning, implicitly or explicitly, is for inanimate things, for rare or unusual things, geology, water bodies, and historical sites where the boundary between the inanimate and the human interest becomes less clear. I'm sure you will think of examples from your studies and experience. Today, in the 23rd year of this century and this millennium by our calendar, we find humanity, society, a concept once questioned by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, we find it in a state of shock. The international order is highly competitive. The world is now overpopulated, by humans, that is. 6 decades ago, a group called the Club of Rome drew attention to this issue. Here we see the president of the Conservation Society address the issue in European Conservation Year 1970, over half a century ago, the year in which the Duke of Edinburgh, accompanied by Prince Charles, chaired the Countryside in 1970 conference at London's Guildhall. Considering human population, Britain stands or sits at the fulcrum, if that is the right word. The Industrial Revolution, still with its proud advocates, began here. It was British inventors, engineers, and new industrialists who led the dramatic transition from mainly rural communities and small trading towns to the world trading patterns that have evolved since the late 19th century. One measure of Britain being overpopulated by humans, not by skylark or yellowhammer, that is for sure, may be the period when the country ceased to be able to feed itself, when it began to rely on imports of food and drink. That may have been around 1880, by which time my grandparents were young children in populous London. There had been early town planning, Victorian street planning, grand designs for parts of cities, Edinburgh New Town, the royal parks of London and associated areas. There followed several industrial estates and housing, Port Sunlight by Lever Brothers, Cadbury's Bourneville, Fry's in York. Successive governments have struggled and postured to cope with the physical infrastructure and development demands of a rising population. Politicians seeking re-election have offered the electorate successive visions of improvement, offering betterment and expectation. Even this September, we find the government and opposition vying for economic growth accolade. Are they learning nothing from the climate emergency and decades of nature losses? Perhaps not. Many things do get better, though often with unforeseen consequences, with side effects in medical parlance. Climate change is the big one here. It is truly shocking. Predicted all of 40 years ago, your parents and guardians may even have heard wind of it while at school. Today, there is no getting away from it, though I expect even now you may not be quite as well equipped as you may need to be. A, to recognize things in the geographical development and land management world that are going to be troublesome, or B, to have technical tools, systems, and communications to deal with them in a timely fashion. Changing the subject, I mentioned working on a design guide. Architects tend to dislike them, perhaps especially if written by planners. 5 or more years of training give an architect a formidable understanding of structure, physical relationships, and technical possibilities. Geographer planners, by contrast, are arguably less well equipped to analyze built forms, though they find themselves influencing settlements and responding to planning applications. Better planning services have access to architectural advice. I think of Southwest Hampshire and Norfolk and outstanding historic cities such as Bath and York. A working blend of geographer planners and architects may be the optimum. An approach that appealed to me to propose was a back to basics one. One might call it an ecological one. The idea is notionally to strip back a developed area to its landform as far as can be discerned, to allow its drainage, its original rivers, to emerge from canalized drains, to visualize the tree-topped hills and areas of heath, Hampstead Heath, Mousehole Heath, Norwich. I offered this as a way of thinking to Sandwell Metropolitan Borough in 1998. Ecology has bounced into pole position as one of the main games in town. Even Sir Nicholas Soames, a grandson of Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill, and himself a former Tory MP, acknowledged on BBC One Sunday with Laura Kuenssberg that King Charles's long interest in the environment had become mainstream. For many people, the world of ecology is becoming the stuff of disturbed nights, a game of consequences, of knock-on effects. Frozen Planet 2. Wood smoke filling early dwellings, water wheels made to turn, not always romantically so. Then the age of coal fires, witness the chimneys of Old Town Edinburgh, from domestic hearths to industrial boilers, steam engines and enormous power stations, still being designed and built on our one shared planet. The poor fossils of Earth science are still having a massive impact on human and other lives, as we all know. You each will have your own current position on energy alternatives, and will be familiar with the succession of international scientific analyses and predictions of different energy scenarios and their impact on the environment. Back to my experience on that score then. 3 illustrations, one from the late 1970s, another from 1991, and one from this year, 2022. Some of you may well be familiar with the small town of Llanberis at the northern foot of Snowdon, Yrwyddfa in the native Welsh language. The town served one of the world's biggest slate quarries, helping to roof the world. Engineers from the former Central Electricity Generating Board saw the potential in the Slate Mountain for a powerful power station. That is 1,800 megawatts installed capacity. My role as your sometime Birmingham geographer, come countryside planner, was for a few months to dodge the effects of semi-liquid CEGB lunches and to liaise effectively on the planning aspects of this scheme as it was being finalised on the ground. So buildings along 10 kilometres of underground cabling for landscape reasons, a small monitoring building on the important Padang Country Park, a small car park on the scenically important land between lakes, Llinai, Padang and Peris, lying below an early Welsh castle, the appearance of the Llyn Peris power station entrance, Llyn Peris lake level and looking down, and not least the issue of waste rock from the vertical shaft down which the water from the top lake would fall when released, allowing the station to achieve 1,800 megawatts generating load in 18 seconds. 6 hours later, running at full flow, it runs out of water. Then surplus electricity, mostly nighttime nuclear generation at that time, was used to pump the water back up from Llyn Peris to the top lake, Llyn Marchlyn Mawr. That lake's capacity was increased with a dam, for which we also made landscaping suggestions. This entire pump storage power station was the largest civil engineering contract ever awarded by the UK government at that time, and took a decade to build. Moving now to Mid Wales and advancing in time to 1991, some 26 years after I and my year of just 30 or so geographers graduated in your great hall, the former World War II Secretary of State and Prime Minister of Suez Canal reputation awarded our degrees with a pre-COVID handshake. The great hall where on Wednesday afternoons in our first year, some of us chose to play compulsory badminton to the loud accompaniment of the hall's organ put through its student paces. "What's the score now?" we would shout across one of the badminton court nets. Mid Wales, just inland of the fine Dyfi estuary, was the location proposed for one of Britain's first wind farms. As a member in spring 1989 of one of the Countryside Commission's 9 counties England Midlands team of 7 professionals, I had learnt of an upcoming public inquiry into this wind farm in Mid Wales. The Commission's Committee for Wales had lodged its opposition to the wind farm. The Commission will lose this inquiry, I immediately thought. Little did I know that I would be asked to represent the Commission at the public inquiry. Held in May 1991, it was a 10-day inquiry. Its geography and planning were this. The wind farm's proponents, the applicants, had chosen the site with skill and care. As witness for the Commission's by then successor body in Wales, the Countryside Council, I was asked by the planning inspector, "Has the area proposed for this wind farm ever been identified by a government countryside organisation as being of national landscape significance?" "No, sir," was the reply I had known for months I would have to give. The lesson was that the Countryside Commission's Committee for Wales, which included a persuasive young local authority deputy chief planning officer, seems to have made an expensive error in opposing this wind farm, which incidentally was the first such inquiry in Britain. Meanwhile, also in 1991, the very first wind farm to be constructed, called Delabole and in Cornwall, was started. So often, working in the field of town and country planning, it is the many decisions made by other people that affect, influence and determine what we can and cannot do. To those of you who will find yourselves contributing to planning in some form or other, I would say this: make a point of trying to understand what is going on and think about how reasonable, sensible, and professional the project is that you are working on. Be courageous and seek ways to put your thinking, your views across, albeit diplomatically. Do not be afraid to think for yourself, and look for allies who also think as you do. That brings us to our third illustration on energy. A marine tidal scheme that is starting construction. It happens to be another Welsh one, all to the west of Birmingham, unless, that is, one takes the longer way round. Called Morlais, the project manages a 35 square kilometre area of seabed off the coast of Holy Island, or Ynys Cybi, Anglesey. The scheme received consent in December last year, 2021. The schoolteacher father of a good friend of mine would be immensely proud of his son, Gerard Llewellyn-Jones, who has led the proposal from the beginning and is now its senior owner. Many renewable energy projects, not just this one, have local community involvement. The Morlais Tidal Energy Scheme intends to reinvest its profits through a community benefit fund and associated environmental and community projects. Various mechanical engineered devices are now being sought to capture the tidal energy. I expended some energy learning to swim in the sea off Holy Island, my home for most of my childhood, before arriving as a fresher here at leafy Birmingham and B15 2TT. Its campus carries memories of the metalworks, of the drop forging plant that thumped away all day near the Selly Oak Engineering and Estate Department corner of the campus. The arc of this countryside career of mine began walking up the 2 or 3 steps into the Crown Estate's number 1 Cambridge Gate Regent's Park, where Savills have recently been marketing a large lateral triplex apartment for £25,500,000. I read that correctly. My career ended officially in January 2004, when I walked out of the 2-story prefabricated central government agency building in Bangor, North Wales, with its time-limited planning permission. That evening, I caught a train to Manchester to attend a string quartet concert at the Royal Northern College of Music. That small and administratively based National Parks Commission for England and Wales had worked out of the Regent's Park building before the organisation's metamorphosis into the Countryside Commission in July 1968. Next door, incidentally, is the Grade 1 listed modernist masterpiece, quote unquote, the Royal College of Physicians, the building designed by the architect Dennis Lasdon. I'll say that again. Next door, incidentally, is the Grade 1 listed modernist masterpiece, quote unquote, the Royal College of Physicians building, designed by the architect Dennis Lasdon, who also designed the National Theatre on the South Bank, opened in 1964. Often it is possible to visit the RCP building, and its medicinal garden is essentially open to the public. The 2 commissions' statutory functions, as you will know, include designating national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty. Other requirements and powers were added for the 1968 Countryside Commission. A professional lead officer, Reg Hookway, a Devonian who had been Deputy County Planning Officer for Norfolk, was appointed Coastal planning and heritage coasts were reported on for England and Wales. Country parks were identified and approved. A programme of grant aiding followed, which increased after the organisation moved to Cheltenham as a headquarters and spawned 8 regional offices, including one for Wales. Geographer-planner Reg Hookway was recalled by Open Spaces campaigner Kate Ashbrook in her online post of July 2018 as a mercurial and ebullient person who introduced ideas from the United States of countryside interpretation. Reg Hookway also introduced the important idea of countryside management that was then piloted in the uplands, in urban fringes, and on the coast. In fact, almost anywhere in the countryside, which still broadly means across most of the country. More than 50 years later, the truth of the matter is that countryside management is a Cinderella activity. Budgets, mostly set by government, are insufficient. My saying that may not surprise you, yet it is chorused time and again, and largely to deaf ears, by designated landscape organisations, local authority staff, and their supporters. That is not to say that there have not been, from time to time, better than average budget settlements for countryside management, nor that financial support schemes for farming conservation have not been trialled and introduced since about 1970. How much of that money has gone into actual conservation on the ground, whether an EU subsidy scheme or otherwise, is open to debate. The political purse strings for countryside management activities, whether tree planting, wall building, or footpath creation, are tightly held and subject to fluctuations that make planning, and programme management challenging. Whilst our politicians, responding to the weather vanes of their human electorate, fail sufficiently to prioritise the sustaining environment, countryside planning and management and countryside services, whether public, private or voluntary, will struggle to be as effective as they should. Countryside management sits within several spheres of land management: farming and rural estate, forestry and water, wildlife and nature reserves, country parks and access land. All these involve planning activity. That is where the umbrella title of countryside planning comes in. To speak of town and country planning together is only partially helpful. Countryside planning itself is not about rural housing and services. Those are more allied with development planning. Countryside planning is rather an activity that connects development planning with countryside management. Planning as an activity is seen by many as necessary or desirable, as resources are exploited and abused. By others, planning is seen as a necessary evil, to be avoided where possible, much as paying tax is avoided. In a way, that brings us full circle, except to say that I chose to retire at the age of 60, which actuarially can be a healthy thing to do. To retire from the fray that employment can be, and to do something more creative. This desire recalled my very first job, the Unilever Lintas traineeship of 1966 to 68, where incidentally I was able to brief the company logo, used to this very day. In early retirement, I embarked on a creative and critical senior master's level degree, part-time, with an unfulfilled diversion towards a PhD. It involved writing a play. My chosen topic was climate change, the play being drafted in 2006. 2 years after I had attended a centenary event in the GES school here. There, meteorology academic and reader John Thornes tabled a substantive book he had written, published at the university. It was to give my play its main character and associated ones. I should explain that it is in 2 acts. The first in the artist period of the first half of the 19th century. The second, the present day, the characters returning in various guises to discuss and promote climate science. Also in early retirement, I was invited to present the land map, landscape information's methodology, to an audience jointly hosted by the Moscow Regional Planning Authority and the Council of Europe's Sustainability and Landscape Division. The Council of Europe, through its legal and liaison work on the European Landscape Convention, had played a significant role in the Cardiff European Landscape Conference of 2003 that I organised with much assistance. Many shades of British and foreign expertise contributed. Its programme and report were published in 3 languages, including French, that out of respect for the Council of Europe. 2 years after retirement, I contributed one of the 25 essay chapters of the book, Europe's Living Landscapes. My contribution was about one of the smallest areas of the European continent featured in this compendium of essays, written to a standard format. It is about my native area of Holy Island, Aniskubby, that I mentioned earlier in relation to naming a strait of water, and about the Moralice tidal scheme. The theme I chose to highlight in my book essay, having known the area for over 50 years, was that of the pressure for change, which I described as relentless. It was no exaggeration. Published in 2007, the book that is, within a decade, a planning permission was granted for a 500-cabin holiday resort on this relatively small island. An approval that has compromised an area way beyond the actual site of the cabins in the form of so-called mitigation land. If that's not a bargaining chip, I don't know what it is. You see, many planners have a personal employment and income interest in there being ever more development. Independently of this planning application, in 2021, I proposed a 30-hectare woodland park on AONB designated land between Holyhead Town and Anglesea's main resort of Treava Bay. The proposal has in principle support of the National Forest for Wales, the Natural Resources Wales Agency, and the Isle of Anglesey County Council. The Council has funded a public consultation on the idea of community woodlands. Such a group is a necessary condition for public funding of the woodland park. The proposed park is currently in 8 different land ownerships, of which 4 are relatively benign in their land management practice. The largest ownership, though, is in the hands of the land investors who have secured that planning permission, the successors to the estate and farm holdings around the former and massive Holyhead aluminium smelter. Until this organisation or its successors agree to the woodland park, the proposal will be seriously delayed. a consultant's report on public reaction to its possible involvement in woodland management, which will require commitment and effort on the part of the community group, is awaited, as is an indication of the County Council's intentions. They are the principal countryside planning and management body on Anglesey, though several other organisations, apart from the numerous farm managers, are active in defined areas. Natural Resources Wales, with its National Forestry and Wildlife Conservation remit, is the largest such landowner on Anglesey. The public membership organisation, the RSPB, already manages a not insignificant area on Holy Island, while the North Wales Wildlife Trust manages small reserves and landscape-scale areas elsewhere on Anglesey. The National Trust's holdings include Plas Newydd, an historic estate beside the Menai Strait, the Double Tides area that separates Anglesey from the mainland of Wales and therefore of Britain. A life lived then may be made up of many memories, and especially of connections, of links between places and people. Tutors, for example. My experience as a bromophile is that the character and particular drives and concerns of individual university teaching staff members will stay with you. I and my 30 contemporaries were taught here in the geography department by 10 staff. Their specialisms spanned geomorphology, climatology, soil science, biogeography and surveying, cartography in the West Midlands, human and historical geography, the economic geography, the history of geographical thought, and also West Africa. We were not, in 1964-65, taught statistics. Our year had field weeks in the North York Moors and Pembrokeshire, and a fortnight in southeast France. For 3 weeks in July 1963, 16 of us ran weather stations across Southwest Ireland's Dingle Peninsula. We downed Guinness in a very rural pub and danced a night away in our boots at a town ceilidh. Geography can be a tough subject. Well, it did rain almost every day for those 3 weeks, and one incessantly wet day, 2 of us accompanied the departmental head and his PhD student up a remote glaciated valley to the quarry. As we scrambled up, David Linton told us he could muster all our ages put together.